Hi, this is Morgan Starry.
And this is Jamie Richter.
And you're listening to On Topic. Right now we're speaking with Dr. Roger Lear, author of Aliens in the Scalpel. Dr. Lear has been said to be one of the world's most important leaders in physical evidence research involving the field of ufology. As a podiatric surgeon, he and his surgical team have performed 9 surgeries on alleged alien abductees. This resulted in the removal of 10 separate and distinct objects suspected of being alien implants. These objects have been scientifically investigated by some of the most prestigious laboratories in the world. Their findings have been baffling, and some comparisons have been made to meteorite samples. Dr. Lear anticipates performing more surgeries in the future and will investigate the physiological and biological aspects of the abduction phenomenon. He has also formed a nonprofit organization for this purpose called A&S Research Incorporated. You can visit him at his website, alienscalpel.com, where you can also purchase educational material. Dr. Lear, for listeners who may not be familiar with your work, will you please start telling us a little about your personal history and how you got involved in the field of ufology?
Okay, I'd be most happy to. First of all, I need to make a little correction in the bio. We've done now 16 surgeries and have 17 objects, which have been subjected to extreme analysis by world-class labs. I got started in this some years ago, basically as a challenge to prove that this was scientifically the biggest bag of nonsense that I ever heard in my life. Now, someone at a conference showed me a set of x-rays, which he touted a couple of what appeared to be metallic objects in the toe as alien implants. And believe me, my interest goes back many, many, many years to my childhood. And during the time of Roswell in 1947, I have a very clear recollection. My father bringing the newspaper home, laying it on the table. It was the San Francisco Examiner, and reading the headline to my mother that stated, U.S. Army Air Force captures flying saucer. And he went on kind of a long dissertation about how he always said there was other intelligent life in the universe. And I remember that conversation very well. So my interest started many, many, many years ago. And I conceive other intelligences coming and visiting Earth with some kind of flying vehicle, intelligent control. I have to remember that the time when I started the implant surgery, the abduction phenomena was not really accepted through the channels of ufology. MUFON, UFO, the organizations weren't really looking at that. They thought it was a bunch of nonsense. And then finally someone started taking a look at cases like Betty and Barney Hill, Travis Walton, Whitley Strieber, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it became more notoriety and reached probably a climax when the late John Mack from Harvard University came out with his book called Abduction. And that led credence to the possibility that people were being abducted. So the time I got involved in this, I mean, I could conceive all this, but then to say that people got out of their craft or did whatever they did to abduct people and then implant them with objects was just a little over the top for me. and no, there was nothing in the literature about this. I studied this for some time, and there was no physical, and nobody came out with one. Where was the implant? So what they looked like was leftovers from maybe an older foot surgery, and I just said, well, that's what they look like, and I turned around, laughed, and walked away.
Yeah, I remember reading Whitley Strieber's book, Communion, and I think in there he mentions that he had some kind of object implanted in his ear, which is just so odd. So you're a surgeon who's known for your involvement in removing these pieces of metal with mysterious properties from the bodies of alien abductees. So how did you first discover that these were non-terrestrial objects?
Well, the section director from MUFON, the state section director, was with me at this conference, and she was quite serious, and she said, why don't you come take another look at the x-rays, and we'll, give the guy a fair shot and listen to what he has to say. And so in deference to her, with respect, I went back and I told the gentleman that I think that these look like leftovers from a foot surgery, and he said, well, she's never had a foot surgery. And I said, well, can you prove it? And with that, he reached into a bag similar to what airline pilots carry, a square, rectangular bag, I should say, with opens on the top, and he reached in and pulled out this giant set of medical records, and he said, if you'd like to take these, doctor, and look them over and tell me where she's had a foot surgery, I'd be happy to look at it. And I said, if I can take them in my room and I have tonight to do it, I'll bring them back in the morning, and I'll tell you what my findings were. So I did. And I did not see where there was any medical history that she had a surgical intervention. So I said, well, if you're so convinced that these objects are unusual, to me, they didn't really look that unusual because we do a lot of surgical repair on bones where we put in pieces of metal, pins, screws, plates, etc., etc., and sometimes little pieces get left behind. So that's what I told him. I said, but if you think these are so unusual, why don't you just take them out and see what they are? And he said, well, I think she'd be more than willing to have that done, but unfortunately, she doesn't have any medical insurance, and she can't afford the surgery. So I said, well, where does she live? And he said, in the state of Texas. And I said, I'll tell you what, you get her to California and I'll do the surgery free. So he said, are you serious? And I said, yes, I'm very serious. So as a challenge and for me to have a little fun and prove this was all nonsense, I agreed to do it. And over the next couple of weeks, he called me and came up with another individual who had an object in the back of the hand, sent me the x-rays, and it looked similar to one of the other objects that the lady had in the foot. So I got a general surgeon friend of mine who agreed to go ahead and do the hand as soon as we did finish with the foot. And we had a few surprises during the surgery, but we don't have time to go into it. But there was really no indication that there was anything extraterrestrial. There was just some things that happened. The patients didn't react to the anesthesia the way they should. They came out of the anesthetic state. We had to reintroduce anesthesia. When we got the objects out, we couldn't cut them. They were covered with a soft tissue coating. They were a strange color. We couldn't cut through it because we wanted to see what was inside. So we never got to look at the metal at the time of surgery. So there was absolutely no indication of any extraterrestriality at all. When I got the first path reports back was the first indication that something was unusual, because there was absolutely no inflammatory response by the body. There was no rejection response. There were no large collections of white cells, and the areas were all surrounded with these very strange nerve endings called proprioceptors. So we knew that something was quite different, let's say, about these than were the ordinary. And I had removed hundreds, if not thousands, of foreign objects prior to that in 30-some odd years. So to go to the extraterrestriality, we didn't have any funds for metallurgical surgery until the National Institute for Discovery Science, under the auspices of Robert Bigelow, who lent his skills, money, knowledge, and friendship to us, and took several of these objects and submitted them to Los Alamos National Labs in New Mexico Tech. And we started to get the information back, and then we realized that we had something that was possibly unusual and maybe not from this earth.
What are some of the findings that they came back with from the lab?
because of time limitations, I can tell you where we're at right now. We find that the body of the metallic object is basically meteoric iron. And why is that different than ordinary iron that you find anywhere on Earth? It has to do with the ratio of nickel to the amount of iron. So I'm sure you've heard of nickel-iron meteorites. Well, these are what we call meteoric iron because of the ratio of the nickel to the iron itself. Then now we've gone farther on because of the increase in the amount of scientific knowledge and the equipment at Material Sciences Laboratory, and we find that they contain carbon nanotube structures, which we call CNTs for short. Carbon nanotube is an atom of carbon, and it's stacked one upon the other until it makes a cylindrical tube, and that's a single-walled CNT. But we also find double-walled and triple-walled CNTs, and these go on to, let's compare this to a piece of wire, just plain wire with no coating on it whatsoever. If you take and you wrap 2 pieces of wire, then you begin to get a strand of wire. So we find carbon nanotube strands. And then if you take these strands and you weave them together, we have electronically what we have is a cable. So we find carbon nanostructures that lead into carbon nanofibers, which are essentially the same as a cable. These end up in a crystalline formation of what are scientifically called orthorhombic crystals that are made of the same substance as common ordinary table salt. But in crystallography of table salt, the crystals are all in random shapes. These are what we call orthorhombic. They're rectangular and in particular size. And we know from the early days of the radio, the first radio was a crystal set. So with a crystal set and a copper coil and a battery and an antenna and an earphone, you could get a primitive radio station. So that was the beginning of early radio on the Earth. But this is an object which does emit radio frequencies in the FM band. We've looked at some charts which I can't mention on the air, and they turn out to be fixed or mobile deep space radio communication frequencies. Now, in addition to those things, we find things that are called rare earths. Rare earth elements are elements that are just, as I said, very, very rare. Like we find rhodium, americanium. We found one that had one isotope of uranium. Isotopes, of course, are numbered. Most people know what U-235 is. That's uranium-235 because we like that kind of stuff because we make bombs out of it. So every element has a number of different ratios of isotopes, and when you compare one to the other, wherever you mine it on Earth, the ratio differs within only about 2%. If it's out of the 2% range, then we consider it non-terrestrial isotopic ratios. And so if we look at something that comes from Mars or a rock that comes from the moon or a piece of a meteorite, we're most likely to see similar elements that we have on Earth. But when we look at the isotopes, they're not the same as what we have here. So, and this is another thing that we find in these objects. So we've come a long way. We know that they're very sophisticated nanotechnological devices. We've had several nuclear physicists on our board of ANS research. One has used mathematical formulas and have come up with the approximate area of our universe, not this solar system, but another solar system, which is about 1/3 away across the Milky Way galaxy as to the origin of the materials. And he did a time constant based on the Big Bang theory, and he said that this has to come from a civilization which is at least 80 million years older than we are.
Do you have any of your own theories into why these things are being implanted into people and who the entities are that are implanting these objects?
Well, I try and stay with academic science. Within academic science, you can theorize, and that's about all we can do at this point, because it would be absolutely egotistical, illogical to determine the logic used by a race of individuals that's almost 1 million years older than we are. So some of the principles may be the same. So based on human logic, obviously they're devices for transmitting information that they want. Now, I've studied the abduction phenomenon now for many, many, many years. I've been in 42 countries in 7 years, and it's a worldwide phenomenon. Mostly all of the abductees will describe procedures that are done usually wind up with the taking of ova and sperm. So these are not representatives from the cooking channel making omelets.
Yeah. It's fascinating how many stories there are that are so similar from all different parts of the world. I find that to be pretty amazing.
Basically saying the same thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically the stories are the same. There may be a little bit differences. There's differences, for example, in different cultures. You go to Brazil, and it's probably one of the few countries in which you can get a tourist guidebook, and it'll tell you where to go see UFOs. Some of the experiences that humans have gone through down there are certainly not the same as the ones that the people in the United States have gone through. In 1952 or 56, I've forgotten the exact date, there was a massive amount of UFO activity on an island called Leir, which is in the jungles. And there were flying vehicles that were flying around, and they were putting out some kind of energy beams and actually taking blood from the individuals, and some of them were quite maimed, and it was not nice. You don't hear too much of that in other countries. In Russia, in the Middle East, there's reports of giants. In Israel, they've had witnesses that were on kibbutzes where actual craft lands, and very large people wearing spacesuits get out and collect samples of crops and so on. But basically, it's the same scenario.
Speaking of other countries, I was wondering, because you've recently done a lot of work on the subject of UFO phenomena in other countries, so what do you find are the differences between the way these countries feel about UFOs versus here in the U.S.?
The severity of abductions in the United States, of course, we have no language barrier either. I mean, we do communicate in English. So basically, what it amounts to is a person. Now, I want to tell you that the debunkers, the skeptics who are paid for their opinions, by the way, will say that, this is a hypnagogic sleep, exposure to electromagnetic fields, and so on. And there's ways to stimulate the mind so you can conjure up beings and creatures and so on. But this absolutely has no basis in anything, particularly a hypnagogic sleep, because it's absolutely a fool's paradise to believe that all abductions occur at night. In fact, it's a rather small percentage that occur at night. There's the ones that are popularized, but most abductions occur during the daylight hours when the individual is not sleeping. So, the stories are about the same. They're taken and undergo some kind of a physical examination, and ova and sperm are taken. Sometimes an abductee during the second or third trimester of pregnancy will be taken, and the fetus will be removed and raised in a container of fluid. And then again, maybe a year or two later, that abductee will be taken and presented with a child, which appears to have both human and non-human characteristics. Some of these females are repulsed initially by what they're seeing, but then automatically the mother instinct takes over and they recognize this as their child. So this is common within the United States as well as in other places in the world.
Wow. I saw the footage you posted at the Coast to Coast AM website of the 2009 UFOs off the Turkish coast, and that is some pretty bizarre footage. Would you talk a little bit about what you experienced while you were in Turkey?
Oh, okay, yes, that would be the Comburga sighting. I was there 3 years in a row and was with the group, I think it was the last time or the time before 2008 or 2009, where Jaime Maussan from Mexico had a crew there also with cameras. So the object was filmed off the European coast. As we know, Turkey is a country which occupies two continents, Asia and Europe, and this was on the European coast, a very small town called Comburgas. And there's a lot of footage that's out there. You can find it on YouTube and other places on the web. I still may have it on my website, which incidentally is alienscalpel.com. But we stayed up filming from 12 midnight to about 5 in the morning out over the sea, and it was a very bright moon that night, which is not the greatest environment for filming UFOs, but the amount of UFOs that we had seen over there prior to that was tiring, let's say. It was like watching the cars on the freeway. It was just all over the place. But this nighttime footage with a full moon, we saw a bright spot below the moon that we thought was either a star. We had surveyed the water with binoculars and high magnification camera equipment prior to the time we started filming. So we knew there was no boats on the water, there was no reflective objects, there was no beacons of any kind. So we use that as criteria that the things we were looking at weren't reflections or something of that nature. So the first thing we did was we focused on the moon, which was extremely bright. The camera that was used for this had a 300 millimeter lens and an electronic doubler, and that means you can go to 600 millimeter magnification. So once we had zoomed in a bit on the moon, we moved the camera to the position where we were looking at this little bright object and then increased the magnification until we got to the point where we could see a craft. And it was the angle that we were looking at first seemed round, but later on in our observations we realized it wasn't completely round. It was more of an oblong shape because it finally turned on its side, and you could see that there was not the round circle towards the rear end of the craft. So we were looking for quite some time at the front end, which had 3 ports. Now, I must say the craft itself was lit by the very bright moon, and you could see that it was a metallic craft, and it was quite distinct. However, there was light coming from 3 sections of the leading edge of the craft that you can call them ports or windows or observation places or whatever you want to call them. And we could see the entities that were up there in those spaces operating the craft or doing whatever they were doing.
What did they look like, by the way?
Well, one was the typical gray with, the elongated neck, large head, black eyes. There was another one that looked more doggish and more reptilian. There's the video was sent first to the University of Istanbul, and they went over and did a complete analysis and determined that it was exactly what we said it was. It was not a hoax. It was not photoshopped, etc. And then a secondary analysis was done in Chile by a videographer who took each frame of the video, and each video goes by the aperture in the camera at 30 frames per second. And each one of the video frames is composed of, let's say, 2 pictures, which we call visual fields. So for every single frame that goes by, you have 2 visual fields. So if you go 30 frames, then you have 32 visual fields. Well, he got a frame splitter, and he took the frames apart. So for each picture, he had 2. And then he went into a deep analysis of what these entities look like and, surprisingly enough, what they were doing at the time that we were filming them.
Could you ascertain what it was that they were doing at that time? Could you understand what they were doing, or did it just appear that they were flying over our atmosphere, or underneath our atmosphere, I should say?
He made quite an analysis of what they were doing. They obviously knew we were filming them, but they were engaged. Each one of them was engaged in a separate activity. Now, we don't know whether that was the flight deck of the craft, and that they were, manipulating controls, because, as I said, they did turn the craft, so we got a very good look at the side, and then they turned it back again, so we were looking at the front. But they were quite distinct, and some of them, they said they looked like they were either writing something on some kind of electronic device or drawing something. He was very, very specific in the activities they were engaged in. But obviously, they were watching us as well as we were watching them.
It's so weird. And for the listeners, if you're interested in seeing the footage, you can Google Roger Lear UFO footage, and it's the first thing that comes up. I
was just wondering, what are your hopes for the future of UFO research and or government disclosure?
Well, I almost hate to answer that question on the air. I'm certainly less concerned about government disclosure and the effect of ETs as I am on the human aspect of what's going on around the world, and particularly in this country. I think that any good observer, without a particular political view, will see that things are degrading to the point where we are at a high danger level of losing not only our freedoms, but being poisoned from the air we breathe and the food that we eat, and a takeover of a society which was once free into something combination between Bolshevik communist and Nazi state. It's really scary, and unless people wake up or we do get intervention from the outside, I really hate to say this, but things look very bleak. I would hope, and I'm working towards this because I was at the citizens' hearing in Washington, D.C. for 5 days testifying before a congressional committee, and at least we got their attention, and at the present time they're trying to they're putting together a bill which we want to put before the General Assembly of the United Nations. And they told us that it would be ridiculous to put it before Congress because Congress was just filled with people who were under the control of lobbyist money, and nothing would get done. And as far as the United Nations were concerned, forget the Security Council, because we were under the thumb of the money of the United States. So but they thought that the General Assembly was a good place to go with this. So if we have any hope for political disclosure, I think it's going to come from the United Nations.
Lastly, what is a little about the presentation and workshop you'll be giving at the Contact in the Desert conference that's coming up this August 9th through 11th, 2013?
There's 2 events that are coming up. One is this Saturday night in Thousand Oaks here in Ventura County, California, at the Thousand Oaks Inn. It's a meeting of CERO International, that's CERO. It's a Close Encounter Research Organization. It's a newly formed organization. It's going to become national and international. We're going to do similar things as to what MUFON used to do, except all the information, and I mean all of it, is going to be released to the public as almost immediately as we get it. And our guest that night will be Paul Harris, who's an investigative reporter from Italy. And she's going to talk about a number of subjects, including the black-eyed children and her relationship with Colonel Corso. Then another event that's going to occur in the desert in Joshua Tree, 9, 10, and 11 of August is called Contact in the Desert. We have literally dozens and dozens and dozens of the world's most famous research investigators in the field of ufology. We have the Prestige Shower, which is going to go on at the same time. So we'll have observation cameras and binoculars and equipment set up. So the last time I was there was approximately one meteorite, maybe every 30 seconds. And then there'll be a tour to Giant Rock, the Van Tassel site of years ago where the Integratron was built. So all these things are available on the web. One is contactinthedesert.net, contactinthedesert.net, and the other is CERO, international.com.
Morgan and I are going to be at the Contact in the Desert UFO conference, so we're really looking forward to it. We're looking forward to that meteor shower. So, Dr. Lear, thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate having you on.
You're quite welcome.